Welcome to the Estates Made Simple podcast with Jenna Carvello and Gordon Vanderleek. We are on a mission to simplify the world of estate administration, helping executors gain the knowledge required to manage an estate. Please note, the following is for informational purposes only and is not to be considered legal, tax, or financial advice. We recommend you seek individualized advice for your unique situation with qualified professionals.
Welcome everyone to our podcast today. It's a very special day with our very special guest, Mike Kind, partner of Estately Canada. Mike has a vast number of years of experience dealing with personal property and real property. And so we wanted to chat with him today about the exciting world of what he does. And he'll share with us some tips and tricks for executors when they're dealing with this type of thing in an estate administration. Welcome, Mike, and Gordon. Nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I'll add my welcome also, Mike, to the podcast. And while we normally have the conversation between Jenna and I, which of course is always riveting, as our audience members will know, we are really looking forward to having you as a guest. And we're so grateful that you took time to join us. And as those on watching the YouTube channel will see, that you are en route and you are, maybe that I guess is indicative of your work is you're not stuck in an office 9 to 5. In fact, probably the exact opposite, right? It's like you're on the road a lot. So tell us a little bit about, that background and kind of maybe what you're doing today. And that's a good precursor for our audience knowing a little bit about kind of the work you do, and look forward to this conversation. So take it away.
Well, firstly, thank you guys very much for bringing me on. It's an absolute honor to participate in something like this. Today we are so there's never a day that's the same. I should almost start with that. So today's rather interesting. So we cleared out an estate about 6-8 months ago, and the property was still going through the probate process with the trust company. And so only now has it just been listed, and the realtor that's involved in the process has asked for, thinks that there's too much moss on the roof. And so we are going to this property to clear off some moss. We did have a contractor that the contractor went there and said there was too much ice on the roof. So this was about a week ago. And so the realtor says it has to be done. So we're going there and figuring out a way to get this done. So it's just, this is only one little tiny snippet, but they're stuck with a property that's been sitting for, I think this property's been sitting for 5 years, like literally 5 years vacant. And so now they're finally at the point where they're able to sell it. And now, of course, something has come up where they think they need a little bit of work. So we're going to take care of that for them.
Excellent. Yeah, and probably a lot of the work you're doing, in terms of clearing out and dealing with the estate, one observation would be it's probably very time sensitive, right? Because when somebody passes away, you've got a home, it's not occupied, we have stuff in there, it has to be preserved and protected. And the reality is there's the probate process takes a while. We've had other episodes, right, Jenna, talking about that process, but you probably come in and are dealing with everybody right in the beginning. Maybe take us through some examples of situations where you've had to come in and dealing with the personal effects, and what are some of the first things you do, and maybe some methodology. How do you help executors deal with those personal belongings when somebody passes away and you've, like you're doing now, have to drive to the place and figure things out, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. So typically the very first thing, and I mean, some companies, they're always conscientious of money that they're going to be out of pocket. So sometimes they want to try and talk about things on the phone. They want to send pictures, but pictures 1,000 words. I hate to say it. They don't even come close. And the generation that we're dealing with, and this, I don't want to sound morbid, but it's, the people that are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s right now, that particular holding on to things because they lived through restrictions during wartime. And so they hold on to things. Things are very important to them, and much less important to the generation that's taking over these items. So what we notice is things get stuffed in corners, under beds, in in crawl spaces, in attics. And so we always recommend, let us do a walkthrough with the powers that be. So it could be the executor, it could be a trust company. Let us do a walkthrough first, and then we can create a scope that goes from there. So there's items that have lots of value. There's items that obviously don't have value. There's also items that people think have lots of value and really don't. You know, we've probably heard 10,000 times someone say, do you know that my mom spent $8,000 on her bedroom set? And it's a real sobering thought when they realize that that bedroom set might get $200 now. And sometimes it angers them. So it's really sobering for us to do a walkthrough and then create a scope where things can be directed where they're going to obtain the highest value return to the estate. And we're impartial. So we go in and, I mean, here's an example. We've got an estate in Creston right now where the trust company and the family members thought that the art had a tremendous amount of value. We went and did a walkthrough and realized that maybe only 2 pieces have a tremendous value. The rest, unfortunately, do not. And then we have to deliver that message and then now create a scope that works for them and gets them the highest value, knowing that some of them are much diminished in terms of the return. So yeah, it always just starts with this walkthrough, and we will look at every single option. Sometimes it might need something. Sometimes I was saying to Jenna yesterday when we talked, sometimes it might be a rental property, and yes, those items have to stay or be preserved, but every month that goes by, another rental payment takes money out of the estate. And so every single situation is different. And so time can be of the essence, for sure.
And so when you're dealing with all these personal items, and as you mentioned, some items have no value where the family does believe they have significant value, you probably also deal with lots of items that have sentimental value. And so if you're dealing with a family that maybe has conflict over how these items should be divided, do you have any sort of practices or processes that you could recommend that executors consider when they're in your shoes as well?
So the short answer is no. Unfortunately, no easy way to deal with it. The easiest way is for the person before they pass to really articulate those items in a will. We dealt with one for the government about a year ago. No word of a lie, there were 17 people that had to have specific items directed to these individuals. And the person that wrote the will actually took pictures of every single item and had them as an addendum to the will. Now that's super rare. We all know people say, well, all my china goes to Debbie. And then Debbie gets to that point and Debbie's like, I don't want the china. Like, people don't have formal dining rooms anymore. So that can create challenges as well. But the short answer is no, unless they do their due diligence at the very beginning, they have those conversations at the very beginning and disclose that in the will, it's going to be a bit of a foggy process, unfortunately, and it can be real contentious between family members, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
What steps do you take? I was just thinking with regard to coming in sort of maybe first on the scene or very early on the scene, in terms of determining insurance. If you take charge of items, does your company, then your insurance policy covers that, or do you have to go do some due diligence to figure out if insurance coverage is in place, particularly for the more valuable items that might be there, artwork, vehicles, other things, all the movable stuff within the house? How do you handle the whole process of ensuring their safekeeping in the event of a destructive event like a fire or a theft or something like that?
So we will advise, because typically it's either the executor or the trust company that's involved. They have to get insurance. So first off, vacancy insurance is different than, or a vacant home costs way more to insure than an occupied home. So that has to be, and they're going to have to be prepared to spend that money. So you're going to have to place with the proper insurance, and that is done almost immediately by the trust companies that we deal with. And if we had to deal with an individual, we would advise them of that immediately as well. as well.
Yeah. So I'm thinking from what you said earlier, maybe that was another question I had, is just on the whole inventory process. It sounds like one of the things you're doing is actually creating that inventory, right? Which was going to be really helpful for the executor to know, okay, what are we even dealing with in terms of communicating with the beneficiaries? Here's what we have and here's the value that's there, right? So it strikes me, I guess I'll just throw it out, you can react to it, but it strikes me that's a pretty valuable part of the services that you're going to do is that inventory, which quite frankly could be quite an onerous task for somebody to do by themselves, and it's done professionally, independently. So if there is contention, at least you're working with, what are we starting with? What is the inventory? What actually exists? And having that thoroughly done versus somebody saying, oh, you're just saying that wasn't there in grandma's house and you may have taken it, right? So there's some protection for the executor to say a third party did that inventory versus they're doing it themselves.
Well, and not only that, but for listeners that have never been through the probate process, part of the probate submission is a balance sheet. And that balance sheet has to have all items of value disclosed in it. And I mean, obviously, it's super easy if an item is $10 or $20. They don't get into the minutia really of that. But I mean, it's items that are say $1,000 and above that they want their tax amount. And if you get a return that's much higher than what you disclosed on the probate, there's going to be additional tax applied. So yeah, it's a real important part of the process is making sure that there's an inventory and then a pretty reasonable fair market value of the item.
Yeah. And I should mention too that, Mike, your office is located in BC, where there is additional probate fees based on the value of the estate. In Alberta, it's generally a flat fee once you get over a certain amount for the estate value. So in BC, I could see how it really does make a difference in terms of the valuation process to ensure the government's getting their fair share of probate fees. And then also for CRA's perspective, because there could be a gain on potential individual items over $1,000 that need to be reported. So that inventory process I could see very, very important. And I know you mentioned, you walk through, you look through all the nooks and crannies. I bet you have some pretty interesting places where you found items or unusual places where you found items. I'll put you on the spot here. Can you share a couple of those interesting stories?
Well, we've found envelopes of money that were taped to the underside of a drawer in a chest of drawers. Definitely found all sorts of unique things in between mattresses. That's a real go-to. We've found things of great value in toolboxes, in tool sheds. So I mean, there's no end. That generation, the 70 to 90-year-olds, they didn't trust the government always. And so they didn't trust that their items would be safe unless they knew that no one else knew where they were. And so there's a lot of that. There's hat boxes at the top of closets. There's some pretty unique places that things are stored for sure.
I know when I acted as an executor, I found some items in the heat registers on the floor. So that's an area that's a good hiding spot for our listeners.
Yeah, no doubt. And I don't think I've actually checked the heat registers. So that tells you.
There you go, Jenna. You've added to his checklist. But I think, yeah, that becomes really important also for getting proper insurance, right? I mean, to have the valuation, I'm just reflecting, we talked about artwork earlier. You look at a painting, if you're not particularly, a connoisseur of a particular type of artist or genre, you're looking at something going, well, that's kind of ugly. I don't like that. But if it's a Picasso, it may look ugly, but it's extremely valuable, right? And getting proper insurance on it. So it just strikes me that that's going to be a really valuable service to have somebody come in, especially if it's a family member who's the executor. The siblings or other beneficiaries might be suspicious or like, oh, you're just lowballing that, or how do you even divide that up? And how does that work in the context of a personal belongings clause in the will? Anyway, just I guess reaffirming the work you're doing can be valuable, not only just to identify factually what's there for probate purposes and good information for the executor, but also for insurance purposes on that. With regard to, I mean, it's looking at from the perspective of somebody who's drafting wills all the time, and I'm putting these sort of vague clauses in the will about, personal belongings. And it would strike me anyway that one of the things you have to do is figure out, well, what is owned, what is not, what is testamentary, what is referenced in the the will, particularly if you're involved in disposing of the property, right? Or once you gather it, now what do you do with it, right? So we've talked a little bit about the inventory process, but I'm assuming your company also helps with the ultimate either gifting to the appropriate beneficiary or selling at auction or otherwise. Can you speak a little bit to that process and what how you like looking for memorandums of instructions or reading the will and things like that? I'm assuming that's part of the process and a pretty important part at the front end, right?
Yeah, typically we don't necessarily read the will. We are typically instructed by whoever the client is. But that being said, we do often get copies of the will, and then we can go through it. We had one that had some real specific instructions where all the items that were of a certain vintage. So this lady was a last living relative of founding family from Worcestershire, England, and she had no living relatives whatsoever, and she gifted her entire estate, which was a multi-million-dollar estate, to a church in Worcestershire. And this was a church that was basically shut down because the roof needed to be done, and it was this outstanding heritage building. But the roof was going to cost a couple $1,000,000 to do on this old building. So she had gifted her entire estate to this church. She had very specific instructions in her will, and over and above what was said in the will, she had conveyed these specific items, or at least the identification of these specific items, to a person. Now, it was a friend of hers, a very dear friend of hers, but I like to refer to her as a curator. And so this lady became our conduit. And every time we went to the property, she would walk through and say, that goes there, that goes there. And it was from extensive meetings over tea. And she was actually a co-executor along with a trust company. So she was named as in a trusting position. And yeah, she was amazing. So like, I would definitely say, if you can't get it in the will, convey it to someone and then name them as an instructor in some capacity in the will, because it will help.
Yeah, and it gives you clear direction as to who to receive instructions from. So otherwise, you start the administration of the estate with ambiguity, right? And that's never a good thing. I think that's been a theme, Jenna, of lots of our podcast episodes of, you want more certainty rather than less when you're dealing with these items. Yeah, no, that's a very good suggestion, and having a plan for that. And I guess the corollary to that is, if you have those instructions, make sure the executor knows where to find them. Don't putting your memo of instructions regarding personal belongings in the heating duct may not be the best solution, right? Or maybe even going through, I suppose you probably run across those items, right, where you're maybe looking for those things in the house as well, if those disclosures have not been made ahead of time.
Yeah, one of our largest clients is the Public Guardian of BC, and so they've instructed us. It's pretty well just carte blanche, but anytime we go into a property, we have to keep our eyes open for anything like that. And then that gets delivered to a specific location where they keep it, they go through it, and they follow direction. But we're just always on the lookout for anything that would be construed as a legal document.
Yeah, which is really effective if there's a lost document, or you have to prove that you've done everything possible to find. Bringing in somebody independent to go through and do that, and that's part of your report, would be, I don't know, from my perspective, a helpful submission to the courts, right? Like, maybe just another question comes to mind with regard to, okay, in terms of the services, and for people or other, for yourself or other companies like you that do this type of work, when would the average executor say that they should reach out and hire somebody like you? Like, what, obviously you could have a very simple situation where, say, somebody's in a one-room apartment in a care facility and there's very few things to deal with. Well, okay, that's easy to do in an afternoon and make that inventory, versus a more complex situation, maybe along the lines of the where you're driving to and that estate. But is there some guidelines or some suggestions, tips of saying, these are the circumstances where you find you're generally involved with versus others, that it really would be good for our audience to know, like when to call somebody like you? Do you have any suggestions or counsel for them as to when it's good to call Mike?
I would say right away. So there's no situation that's too small or too big. And so often we can literally just walk through, and maybe it's a 5-minute walkthrough. and we can help to make suggestions. And there's not always going to be a cost involved, and we're not going to put any pressure on that timeline either. Like, sometimes we're booking 5-6 months in advance because that's when probate comes, or maybe like we said earlier, maybe it's one of those situations where maybe it's a mobile home, and a mobile home has an applicable pad rental. So now that pad rental is $800 or $1,000 a month that's coming out of the estate. Let's get that done sooner. Let's get that place on the market and out, because it's just depleting the overall asset base. And then the same can be said with a rental suite. Like, if they're in a care home, then we're talking anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a month, and then it doesn't take very long to deplete what's remaining in the estate. So yeah, I would say right away, and then we can just plan whatever that date is in the future and work our way back.
So it's really great to have someone like you on the executors team, because for one, as we mentioned, even just having a third independent party who's knowledgeable in the personal effects, it goes a long way to protecting and limiting the executor's liability and disposing of something that maybe had value. Yeah. One thing I find that executors maybe don't consider, or the estate administration process doesn't consider, is the cost of transferring or transporting items to named beneficiaries. And particularly along the lines, if the proceeds of the house go to someone, but personal items within the house have to be shipped across the country, who pays for that cost? And, really, does the executor think about that when disposing of items? Because you did mention you have to achieve the highest value possible. Do you have any comments with respect to shipment costs and maybe it's not even worth shipping across the country if the beneficiaries don't want those items?
That's an outstanding question. So I'm gonna before I tell you the answer, I'm gonna tell you a little story, and this will explain the answer almost. So we had an estate that was up in Kamloops, and there were 3 siblings that were all getting items. One sibling was in Montreal, and it was literally like a little box, 1 box. So that shipment, I think, cost about $600 to actually get it across the country. So 1 box. Then there was one family member in Ohio. That family member had a couple of small items, like small furniture items, and a couple of boxes. I think that shipment was almost $6,000. And this is just what the shippers charge us. Now, if I were to be real brutal, the furniture items might have had a collective value of $200. That's about it. And it cost $6,000 to get it there. Then there was the last sibling, and she was located in California. And she had all like a bedroom suite that had to get shipped down there, and a bunch of items that I don't think it was over $1,000. And her bill was $9,000. But she was adamant that she wanted those items. So that was taken care of. So sometimes their wishes supersedes whatever the return is going to be. And sometimes logic is removed out of that equation, unfortunately. But that comes out of the proceeds from the estate. And it's really unfortunate because, we could have gotten maybe a financial benefit of $1,500, let's say, that would go to the estate. And instead, I think close to $15,000 that was spent out of the estate to get to preserve and keep these items. So sometimes that's the way they want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So particularly, I guess if you're looking for the, from a planning side of it, it would be if you've got relatives who are all over in different jurisdictions, bear that in mind as like who's going to pay that cost, right? And sort of putting some planning on that would make life a lot easier. But of course, oftentimes that's not the case.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Sometimes they're located in Europe. And so this one that we have in Creston, one of the family members is in Europe, and she hadn't been to this property in over 10 years. And so she really has no recollection. And she just says, I don't want anything. Like, you guys get whatever the highest value is, and I'm fine with that. So sometimes they're simple, and we all know sometimes they're not.
Mike, any suggestions? Sometimes I've been asked the question from time to time going, do you have any suggestions on how you divide things up? So let's say you collect it, you have the inventory, and you're helping the executor kind of divide it up. I don't know if those are things that you do or that's beyond the scope, but maybe you have some stories from the trenches about, well, this this kind of process for dividing up the personal property, whether it's drawing lot, you're pulling lots to say who goes first, who goes second, or systems for that, maybe there's been some creative ways that people have resolved the distribution of those personal items that you can share with our listeners.
We've seen the absolute worst case, and then just many where they typically just go whatever the executor kind of mandates, that's what goes. We're typically there almost as an intermediary, and we'll say, okay, well, in this situation, doesn't it make sense, Peter, that you take this, and Jane, you take this? But it's actually pretty rare that it gets to that. What it typically gets to, which is really bad, is that people fight over the dumbest things. And sorry for me to say that, but I mean, they're fighting over linens and these old tube TVs that you can't even throw away anymore. Like, just sometimes it makes no sense what people are fighting over. And they stick their heels in just because they know that Jane wants the utensils, and they think, no, Jane shouldn't have those utensils. I want those utensils, even though they don't want them. And I mean, it destroys families. It really does. This process can either be a blessing or it can be an absolute nightmare and destroy families. And I don't want to say it happens super often, but it happens a lot more often than we'd like.
And so I think that's a nice way to end, to tell our listeners, be mindful of who you're bringing into the process, get some professional help if you need, and just, really think through each step before making rash decisions to try to keep the family together. I mean, losing a loved one is hard enough, and fighting over items just adds to the stress and turmoil. But we really appreciate you meeting with us, Mike. And for our listeners, you help both Alberta and BC estates. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Perfect.
And sorry to actually go back to your point there. I would also say start communicating early. So if you have siblings, talk about things. You don't have to bring mom and dad into it right away, because sometimes they don't want to talk about them dying. And I understand that. But, for instance, my sister and I, my parents are in their 70s, and we've already talked, like, when they pass, we're not going to rush and sell the house. We're actually going to fix it up and then keep it as a central family place where everyone can go and hang out, and maybe it ends up being an Airbnb, but we're not going to rush into that process. So yeah, communicate, talk about things, and then when they eventually happen, then everyone knows what the other's stance is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And even as part of that, just having a clear understanding of what are the important items and making sure they're inventoried, or we're aware of those items, exactly. Right? Because sometimes you get into the allegation of, well, mom and dad always had this item, where did it go, right? And it's missing, right? So you avoid those sort of contentious items about that. And your point's well taken. Certainly you see lots of estate litigation where people are very upset about how the personal items are distributed, and that can spill over into talking about the distribution of the bank accounts and the real estate. So I think that's really good advice to hopefully avoid problems, and then look at bringing in the professionals to help when that comes up, because that can diffuse the situation as well, right? It's not, if it's a sibling making decisions versus you're coming in and making a suggestion like you cited, why don't you do this, why don't you do that, might go over better than if it comes from another family member, right?
Completely agree. You bet.
Yeah, so that could be part of your advertising, is you do, estate mediation, it's like solving the for all the household items, you're the household items mediator.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. Pleasure speaking with you, and good luck at your estate property today.
Yeah, Mike, thanks so much. I think you've shed some good insights, and we appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with our audience today.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Take care.